Jeannie should, I have not heard otherwise, so I suspect she'll be here. Since we're a little after already, let's get going. Call the meeting to order. Roll call, please, Beth.
Mayor Schlum?
Here.
Councilmember Contino?
Here.
Councilmember Leger?
Here.
Councilmember Brown?
Here.
Vice Mayor Hansen? Here. Councilmember Archambault?
Here.
And Councilmember Dickey is not present yet.
Expect her any minute. All right. Welcome to our work study, and this one is being televised. So smile, even though it's going to hurt, this budget discussion.
Is there a price
All right.
page?
First item is discussion relating to the town's 5-year capital improvement plan and funding options. Rick.
Yes, thank you, Mayor and Council. Our intentions were, the last time we talked to you about the capital improvement plan, and specifically road construction, we told you that we would be back this month to speak to you, to continue that discussion, and to also discuss with you some strategies relative to funding some of those capital projects. And probably top of mind is right now the Saguaro mill and overlay. And so with that, we're going to allow Mary to walk us through our 5-year capital improvement plan.
All right. Welcome, Mary.
Mayor, members of the council, this is a follow-up, as Rick mentioned, to our previous work study on the 5-year capital improvement plan. The total projects projected for next fiscal year amount to $13.5 million, and the funding sources that are expected to be used include the Economic Development Fund, grants, donations and rebates, stimulus funding, and the CIP project reserves. We also have 2 projects that remain unfunded at this time. In the Economic Development Fund, there's 1 project in next year's CIP, and that's the Avenues Lakeside project of the Downtown Vision Plan. Let me say along the way, if there's any questions, please feel free to stop me anywhere along the way.
All right. Mary. Councilmember Contino.
Yes, is there a possibility we can get a breakdown of that 290,000? I mean, of what they're going to do with the money?
There are 2 components.
I mean, can we get it in writing?
In writing?
Yeah.
There are detailed project sheets on each of the capital projects, and I'll make sure right after this meeting that I get those detail sheets to the council.
Councilmember Leger.
Could you provide a high-level overview of that 290?
250,000 of it is the continuing set-aside of monies for potential enhancements to the development of the property next door. And another 40,000 of it is for the potential of having to do a downtown parking study.
Thank you.
In the grants category, there are a number of projects. Most of these are continuing projects. They include the Shea Boulevard climbing lane, the Shea widening project, the Fountain Hills Boulevard sidewalk, the annual downtown sidewalk plan, and we have one new one here, the photovoltaic installations project. Is a new one that you'll see in a number of places as we walk through the projects. And then the continuing project, the fire station emergency generators, which is also grant funded. In the donations and rebates,
Councilmember Archambault.
Thank you, Mayor. Mary, in the photovoltaic installations, I'm looking at the paperwork that we got on our worksheets, and it says 80,000, and here you got 47.
there's 2 funding sources for the project.
Oh, okay.
There's a grant funding portion and then an SRP rebate portion for the installations.
80,000. Okay, thank you for that clarification.
And here's the other portion of it. In the donations and rebates category, we have 2 projects. The Downtown Vision Plan project is the greening of the downtown. The primary source of funding anticipated for that project is donations. In the photovoltaic installations, the primary source of funding is rebates. In the stimulus AARA projects group is the Shea Boulevard Gap Overlay Project. Now, this is a project that has been added to the CIP as a result of having one of our stimulus projects come in with a better pricing than was originally anticipated. And so what we are hoping to do is to get a secondary project funded through stimulus funding, and this would be a Shea Boulevard Gap project, which means it's going to try to tie together the space between the two Shea Boulevard projects that we currently have in the CIP.
Can we get a little clarification on what that particular gap is, Tom?
Thank you, Mayor and Council. That is, that would run from Technology Drive to Fountain Hills Boulevard, would be just adjacent to the Shea climbing lane. It would be the north side of Shea, westbound, those two lanes, and we're looking at adding the medians where the medians are not presently installed with landscaping, if that helps.
Would that be resurfacing those?
Yes, thank you. That'd be mill and overlay on those two lanes. They're the westbound.
Then we would put the mediums in there to kind of steer traffic off and go on the other side.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
The projects that are anticipated to be funded out of the CIP Reserve Fund are the Shea Boulevard Widening Project. These are the matching funds required by the grant. Our continuing annual sidewalk program, the Fountain Hills Boulevard sidewalk, the Unpaved Alleys Project. This is again a continuing project. The Shea Boulevard Bike Lane and Shea Gap projects. In a lot of cases, you're going to see them in two places. The matching funds tends to come from the CIP reserve whenever a grant calls for matching funds. We also have the continuation of the traffic signal upgrades project from this year, two park master planning projects, and the voice data upgrades for town hall telecommunications, and the fire station matching funds. Some of the short-term funding issues that we needed to come to council about regard two projects that are in the CIP for next year, but we haven't been able to designate funding for them as yet. The first one is the Saguaro Boulevard Mill and Overlay, and the second is our annual pavement management program. The total of these two is about $5 million. As you can see, I brought a few pictures of Saguaro. For those who haven't made a recent trip out there, the pavement is significantly degraded. The second project that's unfunded is our pavement management project. The council sees this project every year in the CIP, and what it is the town is divided up into segments, and what we attempt to do is go in and do pavement management by sector throughout the year on a regular schedule so that the pavement doesn't become significantly degraded over time, that we make a circuit through town in a reasonable amount of time. Here you see the funding for the next 5 years in the pavement management project. Next year's budget has only about $500,000 in funding, but the 5-year cumulative total is a little over $5 million. One of the questions that came up at last council study session on the CIP was, what is the potential of using the Capital Project Reserve Fund to continue to fund these two additional projects? And what I'd like to do is walk you through what happens to that fund if we choose to go this route. The beginning balance that we anticipate at the end of this year is approximately $10 million. We expect about $500,000 in construction sales tax revenue for next year. We're anticipating using $2.1 million to fund the projects that we talked about a few minutes ago, which would normally leave us with an $8.4 million balance in that fund. If we were to include these two unfunded projects, it would leave us with a CIP fund balance of only $3.4 million. If the fund balance is that low, we can't even continue to funding the pavement management for the next 4 years, because there would be insufficient funds to do that. Thank you, Mary Mayor. Then that would include, when you say that if we used $5 million, that's saying that we're not going to fund the project management. What the $5 million includes would be the Saguaro Boulevard Mill and Overlay, and only 1 year of the pavement management program. So we would fund it only for next year. So, and then what you just said, then that leaves you with not even enough to do the plan, the pavement management. That's correct. But the 500,000 or so, if we use that, we would have significantly more. I mean, obviously, if we use the 4.5 million for the Saguaro, then that's out of the ballpark. But the other one, I don't know if you would agree that that's out of the ballpark. I'm just trying to see what we're discussing here.
Councilmember Archambeau?
Thank you. Mary, clarify that. What I'm looking at up there is proposing taking is the management program up there?
1 year in the unfunded projects included. 1 year of the pavement management project is included, which is $500,000, and then the Saguaro Boulevard Mill and Overlay for $4.5 million. So I'm basically looking to fund only next year's projects.
Oh, yeah, okay. So currently we're going to budget 2.1.
That is
which
correct.
would reduce us to 8.4, correct?
Correct.
And the council's given authorization on an annual basis to basically use about $2 to $2.5 million a year from our capital improvement funds to help partner up with grants and other, in other words, to stretch our dollars. You know, we can use up to that amount. And currently, with the 10 million in reserve, that's only going to take us out 5 years,
That is correct.
unless something starts getting replenished. So if we took the pavement management program and just funded that for next year, that would reduce us to 7.9?
That's correct.
Somewhere around there? Okay. Thank you.
Some of the long-term funding issues that are arising is the fact that the capital improvement funds are insufficient to meet the long-term infrastructure needs of the town. Without a dedicated source of funding, the infrastructure maintenance service levels of the town will continue to decline. Some of the
Councilmember Archambeau?
Are we expecting any LTAF money for next year?
at this point, no.
So that's exasperating our situation, right?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Councilmember Dickey?
If I understand it correctly, we'll never get LTAF money again. At this stage, that is correct. The buckets, not just sweeping the funds, took the program away. Some of the long-term funding options that the council might want to consider would be bonded debt service to provide funding for these types of projects. The kinds of debt service that we might want to look at include things like revenue bonds. One of the ones that the town has used in the past were the highway user revenue bonds. The funding to repay these bonds would come from HER funds. One of the downsides of that is it's a source of funding that is still under the control of the state, which means that any time in the future, we may not be able to count on those funds to continue to pay debt service. The funds are still available next year, but they may not be available for the 20 years that we would need them for debt service. The second option might be to issue general obligation bonds. The source of repayment of general obligation bonds would be a secondary property tax. And then the third option might be a combination of both revenue and general obligation bonds
And cash.
and cash. One of the things that I wanted to mention on behalf of maybe people in the audience who may not be aware of what bonding is, it's something very similar to taking out a mortgage to buy your house. The town would take out a loan in the amount necessary to pay for the projects that we would include in that loan, and that might be things like the Saguaro Mill and Overlay. And then that loan would be required to be paid back over time, typically a 20-year schedule. And then secondary property taxes would be used specifically and only to repay that loan. Those funds could not be used for any other purpose.
What type of interest rates are you getting at this point? And then, I know we have examples of other GO bonds around town, right?
The rates change rather quickly. Right now, we're in a very good borrowing environment because the rates are lower than they've been in quite some time. There are also some stimulus-related loan structures that are available through the end of this calendar year that we might be able to take advantage of as well.
Is there a ballpark percentage?
I think the calculation...
What did we have the last time? What's that bond council? What did he tell us?
Our debt council didn't really include an interest rate in the schedule that he provided me, but I'll be sure to get that
What did we
information.
refinance at? Do you recall what we refinanced bonds at? I'm sorry. Rick?
I don't think it would be out of line to expect something in the 5 range to 6, 5.5. I think last time I've looked at the information given to me by our financial advisor, as I recall, was somewhere in that range.
Okay.
They were projecting that out.
So the options are those and that, or a mix of cash and
Yeah.
any one of those options.
That is correct.
Now,
Okay.
I did want to bring up, there is a third option. Now, both of the bonding options that you see here are options that would go to a general election. The third option is an excise tax bond, which really doesn't consider the source as much as a HERF bond or a highway user revenue bond. And that can be paid out of whatever general revenue the town has at hand. Debt service, and correct me if I'm wrong on that. So that's a third option. But then again, in every case, always when you bond, you're trying to identify where's the debt service going to come from. As you mentioned, right now, because of the evaporation of our HERF revenue and the precarious nature of that revenue, it would be a very difficult task to structure some type of long-term bonding based on that revenue stream. Probably our financial advisor, and I don't say probably, I know for sure because he told me so. You remember Jim Strickland, who we brought here, advised that we look more towards an excise tax bond if we wanted to do a revenue bond. And so, but we would still, that does not excuse us from having to identify a revenue source, even if we decided to go down that route. Obviously, a general obligation bond entails a secondary property tax that would have to be passed by the voters, and that election would have to occur in November. That's a November election. I believe HERF is also a November election. So if we went with a HERF bond. And I think up to this point, if you were to choose either one of those three, given the nature of our budget right now, we'd probably lean towards recommending a GO bond for a project like this. But again, a combination approach may be what you would like us to take. Okay, I'm sorry, Mary, I wanted to make those clarifications.
Some of the scenarios that we'd like to present tonight would be different scenarios based on the size of the borrowing. For example, option one might be a $4 million bond issue. The size of that issue would basically allow us to do the Saguaro Mill and Overlay, but not much else.
Mary, maybe, Tom, you mentioned different pricing for Saguaro last time. Do you have more of a better outlook on that or a worse outlook on that? I thought you'd gotten some feedback that may not have included all the expenses. But
Thank you, Mayor and Council. Certainly, we gave you some pricing that was just for the mill and overlay that we had received from Sunland Asphalt. But what wasn't included in that were all the drainage projects that went along with that, all the conduit for the future signals, all the ADA upgrades that we need to do that we're looking at. Most recently, we've been looking and working with why does Jeff's company, Swaback, excuse me. We've been working with Swaback to look at the intersection of Saguaro and Avenue of the Fountains to make those improvements through the Downtown Vision Plan, since we're going to be in that downtown area. So it seems as though we're slowly adding things, so I'd like to hold on to that number of 4.5 as things keep getting added in. But originally, and you're correct, the price of asphalt has gone down. We've seen that. But I wouldn't want to underestimate anything at this time, just to be on the safe side, if that helps.
thanks. Sorry, Mary.
No problem. On option number one, what I tried to do is give the public an idea and council an idea of what this would look like in terms of a secondary property tax. So I'm assuming a residential property with a $350,000 assessor full cash value. Residential property is assessed at 10%, so that would make it a $35,000 assessment. The annual average tax over the life of this 20-year bond issue would be $35 a year. Option two would be a $10 million potential bond issue. This would be able to provide funding for the Saguaro Boulevard Mill and Overlay project, but it would also give us funding for our annual pavement management project for the next 5 years. How this would affect the average homeowner: the same property that's valued at $350,000 of full cash value would have an annual average tax over the life of the bond issue of $73.50 per year.
Councilmember Dickey?
Thanks. I think I'm missing something. So a $5 million bond would it be $35 a year, and a $10 million bond would be $73. And where did you get the 10 million? You said it would cover, oh, okay, I'm sorry, for the next 5 years. Thanks, okay. The third option is a longer-term funding solution, and that would be a $20 million bond issue, which would provide, again, funding for the Saguaro Boulevard Mill and Overlay project, but it would also provide funding for 10 years of the annual pavement management project. Because it's such a long-term funding alternative, funding on this basis would typically be drawn down as needed over time, instead of having the whole $20 million come to the town at one time. The effect on the typical residential property owner in Fountain Hills, again with a $350,000 full cash value home, would amount to $122.50 in taxes over the next 20 years. Some of the questions that this raises for council is, how should the town fund its long-term streets and roadway infrastructure improvements? In the past, we've tended to do that on a year-by-year basis, not looking for funding beyond next year's projects. The second question it raises is, should the town's citizens be involved in making these choices that will determine the pavement management service levels and the funding sources for these projects? And thirdly, how would you like town staff to proceed with it? And I'm here to answer any additional questions.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you. Council, more questions? Councilmember Leger.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Mary, for the presentation, as usual. Very well done. I had a couple questions, and I'm back on page 4, which is the CIP fund. And this may require a few other folks to come up and address some of my questions here. The parks master plans, you had mentioned 2 parks. I just want to get some clarification on that. I'm not sure if Mark Mayer is here or not, or Brian is here. Are those the parks that we're looking at designing for the school? Is that what that is?
Yes, and it's also master planning Four Peaks Neighborhood Park. We're looking at that too.
Okay.
So it's the 2 park projects and Four Peaks.
And it's all design
Correct.
Design cost on those. Okay. I recently was made aware that the school has been putting off funding of part of that project, the bridge.
Mm-hmm.
I think because they were under the thinking that we probably would not be moving forward as quickly on these projects. Is that your understanding as well?
That is my understanding.
Okay.
On the bridge in particular, yes.
The bridge to nowhere.
Yes.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And my second question regarding that, Mary, and is relative to the fire station matching funds. The assumption there is that we're going ahead and building a fire station, and could someone in the House, perhaps Chief, address where we're at in that process? Is that a possibility? And is there some type of drop-dead date on that? Because we seem to be holding funds hostage, expecting some positive results from the feds.
Mayor and Council, at this point here, we're still in the game. How much of the game we're in, don't quite know. We get no answers back from FEMA when we ask them to please give us maybe so, or better yet, if they don't really know, get a flat no from them so we know to move forward, but we're not getting that. We understand that there's quote-unquote financial turmoil within this grant as far as communities who have been awarded the grant to this point are now backing away. We understand that Mesa may be backing away from $2 million of that $4 million they got just because of the encumbrance of the requirements to build the station where they want to build it. May not be worth their effort to follow through with half of that grant. So we're still in the game. We haven't got a no letter. Again, if I was a betting person, it doesn't look real good. One thing interesting as far as the economy goes is building fire stations, or buildings in particular. Last week I had a conversation with a fire district commissioner by the name of Earl Runke from North Tucson, who covers the Foothills District up to Oro Valley, which is pretty much a mirror image of our community here. And they're building 2 fire stations. They got one coming out of the ground right now, and they got one in design phase. And the interesting point is that they anticipated $250 a square foot to build the station. And the station they're building now came in at $190 a square foot. So there's an interest in the building community to pass along some good deals to anybody who wishes to build a private or a public structure. But as far as holding hostage to matching funds, the only thing I can do is keep you posted if I do hear anything positive, and hopefully we'll hear something by the end of this fiscal year budget, whether or not it's going to be a yay or a nay.
Thank you, Chief. I appreciate that. And the only point I was trying to illustrate is that there's close to $500,000 in those two line items that could be possibly utilized for pavement management. And that was my question was, when's the game over? And if it's over at the end of this fiscal year and those dollars were budgeted for fire, for the matching funds, we could work with that because it's still in the budget and move it over to pavement management. And the same is true with the park design if we decided not to move in that direction and put that off for another year. So I just looking for some wiggle room there, so I appreciate Brian and Chief. Thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
Mayor.
Councilmember Dickey?
Thank you, Mayor. I actually have a question, Chief, too. Are you not recommending that we look at the fire station unless we get the ARRA funding?
Well, me personally, I would say that's a determination that you need to make as our elected officials, and I certainly bow to your wishes, but I guess the question comes down, is it the chicken before the egg or the egg before the chicken as far as road maintenance, which is extremely critical for us because bad roads damage our equipment and costs us more money, but how do you weigh that against response time? And it's not like we're talking about a future third station, which is probably 10 years out now at best. It all becomes down to that all-encompassing question. What's the most important thing for you to do with the limited dollars that we have as a community moving forward? Obviously, I'm biased, and I don't think I really need to tell you my answer. But again, I serve you, and my job is to give you the best information and data that I can possibly give, which I believe we have done in this 7 to 8 year study. And I believe we're at the point, both financially and response time, to make a move on covering the south and the southwest and the west end of our town. We've done a couple of creative things, thanks to Councilman Leger, as far as a temporary ambulance station down in that quadrant down there. But this time of the year, that ambulance is very rarely there because the ambulance demand throughout the valley is extremely high right now. Summertime, they'll probably be there a lot more. But it certainly helps mitigate the timeline situation. But again, I'm here to serve and carry out your wishes. So whichever direction you plan to go is the direction we'll go.
Mayor, thank you. So the original recommendation by the fire department to build another station because of response times to the locations noted stands.
In my mind, this whole fire station issue is based on one thing and one thing only: response time. End of subject. 2 words.
And Mayor, then when we talk about all of these possibilities and things for us to try and look at, I again want to look at the bigger picture, and I know that we had a request regarding reserve fund balance, designated unreserved fund, and rainy day fund balance, and if this isn't the time, we don't have to do it right now, we can do it at another budget, but I do have questions about that. It wasn't exactly, we got the information, it wasn't exactly for this particular agenda, but if we're going to be looking at, like Councilman Leger was saying, at some of these things and what does that give us and what choices do we have, I'd like to examine that a little bit more too at some point.
But we're not making any decisions tonight.
Absolutely.
All right.
Thank you.
Councilman Leger?
Yeah, in response to Councilwoman Dickey's inquiry there, I want to make it perfectly clear. I'm also on board with the need for a fire station and a fire station relocation and diminishing response times, and we have put an interim plan in place that is life-saving. Maybe it hurts us a little on the property side, but this issue for me, for the last 2 years we've discussed this, has always been an issue of affordability. And I think this council agreed to go for the grant funding from the feds because it made the project more affordable. And my suggestion here is kind of a gap solution for the next year, and I look forward to the day when we can afford that fire station. So I just want to make that perfectly clear.
That's crystal clear in my mind. There's no issue with that at all.
Thank you.
And, you know, when we're talking about bond issues, you know, I take off my fire chief hat and I put on my civilian hat, being a taxpayer here in town. Certainly wouldn't hurt me any to tag this fire station on to your 5, 10, 15-year bond issue, because $122 a year for me, it's like going out to dinner one night in Scottsdale or 2 nights in Fountain Hills. So $122 is not going to change my lifestyle, and I'd be more than happy to do my fair share to support the roads, fire district, and any other projects the town deems critical to our lifestyle.
You must not eat at Senior Taco then.
No, I don't eat at Senior Taco. Sometimes.
A lot of people eat at Senior Taco, that is for sure. A lot of people up here eat it. All right, thank you, Chief.
Thanks.
That's a good page to be on, that CIP fund, and that's for just this year. Correct, we talked about 5-year CIP, but this is just for this year's.
This is just the projects budgeted for next fiscal year.
And then we talked about maybe, 9 months ago, maybe we started having our budget discussions about trying to stay around a $2 million figure in spending for capital improvement, because we knew revenues coming into that were substantially less than that, but we do have a decent savings in there, so we agreed at that time not to bring everything to a screeching halt, but to definitely bring the throttle way back. What's hard to tell on the CIP page is which ones, I know we have match funds for Shea, but which ones here are also funded through other means other than the capital fund, or are these the net out of capital fund following grants for maybe sidewalks or other items?
Mayor Schlum, a number of these projects are also funded with other funding sources.
I mean, other than town funds, like flow through grants and such.
The Shea Boulevard widening is grants plus capital projects. The Fountain Hills Boulevard sidewalk is grant plus capital project. The Shea Boulevard gap overlay is again capital projects funding with stimulus funding. So there are a number, and the fire station relocation is also capital projects funding with stimulus funding.
But I'd imagine most of these, for example, the Shea Gap, 65,000, and it's going to be about $1 million project.
Mm-hmm. The
Whatever
balance of the funds are
due to
from stimulus.
the lessened cost of the other improvement. I imagine that 65,000 was budgeted because it's going to be non-stimulus money. It's going to be coming out of our balance.
Right. In many of these projects, there's either a requirement for matching funds, or there's something that is not typically covered by the grant or the stimulus funding. For example, a lot of them don't do the design component, so it would be up to the town to fund the design piece, and then the construction piece would be covered by the grant. Or there's a match required for the entire project. And so in the past, what we've tried to do is to stretch the capital projects funds by using them as the matching source of funding, either to do the design or as the matching fund for construction.
I think given the economy's continued decline here, we might have to look at lessening that $2 million as well. That's why I was asking, but I don't want to be, throwing away grant monies by not fulfilling our 10% portion or whatever it might equate to. Are there any of the projects on these CIP funds that if we do not choose to fund them this year, we would be at risk of losing grants?
Most of the AAR funding projects are time sensitive, Most of the grant projects that are coming through MAG are time-sensitive. Very few of the grants are not time-sensitive to the point where if we put them off, we might likely lose the grant funding.
So the way I'm looking at it, the annual sidewalk program and the Fountain Hills Boulevard sidewalk program paid for substantially by grants, or is it just the design that was paid for by those?
The sidewalk projects, the alley paving projects are entirely funded by CIP.
Okay, so, and the alley, so those three. And then the other ones, the traffic signal upgrades, parks master plan, voice data, those three are also right out of our capital, correct? I mean, the others are out of capital as well, but these are 100% out of capital or close to that.
That is correct.
Okay. So, just to try to get us our arms around it, and if we're feeling a little more constrained like I am on capital, those 6 projects are the 6 projects that I would recommend we most consider reductions of, if we make reductions at all in those 6 projects, because the other ones are leveraged against grants or stimulus dollars coming in. And for example, the fire station funds, we mentioned it being held hostage, but again, if we don't have that budgeted and we do get awarded the monies, then we'd be having to say goodbye to those monies likely. All right, that helps me. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. Mary, I was looking at options 1, 2, and 3, which was towards the end of your presentation. We're talking about general obligation bonds for the Saguaro Mill and Overlay. And those bonds would be 20-year bonds, correct?
For the most part, we're anticipating that they will be. Typically, bonds are going to run the 15 to a 20-year cycle.
So it doesn't make sense to me that I would want to fund annual maintenance for 5 years and then pay for it over 20. The same thing with the other one that would go 10 years for annual maintenance. But I wondered if staff and you and Julie were in our community contracts meetings, and we were talking about identifying other funding sources, and some of them are minimal. And I'm wondering if there's a way to replace the LTAF money that we've lost that would normally go towards helping to fund the maintenance projects. If there's a way of replacing that with, say, like a telecommunication tax or some type of a municipal tax that would be fairly incidental, but maybe mean the equivalent of like $35 per year per residence to fund some type of maintenance. But if you follow me on that one, it then becomes a revenue source that's identified for a specific purpose. And the council can fluctuate it, downwards as the economy comes back to only generate enough revenue that we need to do the maintenance so that we can stay on top of our streets. I certainly don't see that that would be so objectionable, maybe to some residents, if they knew, if I got my cell phone bill and there was a, $2.70 charge on there for, I forget what that tax is called, Julie. What is it? Is that telecommunication tax? I don't know if that would be so objectionable. It'd be certainly a lot less painless than getting the one bill every year when we get our property tax bill and seeing, $122 on there instead of a $35. I think $35 would certainly be more agreeable than, $120 or $73. And I think if we can somehow, we've talked about for the last 8 years that I've been on the council trying to diversify our revenue stream. We're seeing the state more and more pull back that revenue. I don't think it's unconscionable to think that the HERF funds might be in play next year if the economy gets worse. So we have to start thinking outside the box. And I mean, that's just one idea, but I think there might be other ideas out there that we might want to look at that might be incidental, when you look at the bigger scheme of things, but would generate enough revenue to pay for you know, our maintenance program, if that's what we have to do, because, you know, until the economy gets better, it's just going to get worse and worse. And I certainly think we have to go to general obligation bonds for Saguaro Boulevard. And we're going to take, Tom, was that going all the way to Palisades, the Saguaro Boulevard? Can't even spit it out now.
Mayor and council,
Boulevard project?
that's the entire length of Saguaro Boulevard.
That was going all the way to Fountain Hills Boulevard.
Yes, sir.
Which is why we got into the discussion of, we got to do the SWABAC study, figure out what we're doing for parking there, figure out how we're going to make that pedestrian friendly, so that when we get to that intersection, we got a plan in place, right?
That's what we're working on, yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Tom. Well, that's my input. That's just my 2 cents, I guess.
Thanks. On the CIP fund page, just maybe for our next time when you get together, if we could get a better idea of, I know some of those grant monies were paying for some of the sidewalk or portions of the design, and I would like to know if we don't do it this year, if we're going to be at risk or could extend it to the next year. Those types of things would be relevant. Yeah, which ones are encumbered? Thank you.
Mayor Schlum, the individual detailed capital project sheets, which I promised to provide all up to the members of the council, do give that kind of detail because it's a 5-year history of what the funding sources are and the total cost of the project over 5 years.
We do have, towards the end of our packet, we have a breakdown. It doesn't include where the revenues are coming from. It just has the CIP expenditures. The end of this packet that's online. It may be on your PowerPoint. Nope. It's online. It includes some very small print to fit it all on there. 3 pages. It's this here that Councilmember Archambault printed out from the packet. So there is more detail there, but it wouldn't include everything we're asking for. One thing that came up, I'm curious, do you know roughly how much we have outstanding on our bonds as a town today?
With the HERF bond, we will be paying that off this year. So next year will be the first year that bonding for street purposes is done.
Yeah.
And I can't say off the top of my head, well, I can look it up in the budget and tell you what our outstanding debt
I
is.
was just curious. We haven't had a bond released since the mountains. Is that correct? Was the last bond that was done? All right. Other than refinancing bonds. All right. More questions other than Henry?
Mayor's inquiry just reminded me of something. We do have that HERF bond coming due, and if we were to project the same amount of money from HERF, do we know how much HERF money is being utilized on an annual basis against that debt currently?
110. The debt service payment is $110,000 a year.
110 a year? Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you. Councilmember Hanson?
Back to the CIP fund, I concur with the direction you were taking with that. You said that there were 6 of them. Could you just quickly review those 6 again that you had identified? I think you had the annual sidewalk program, Fountain Hills Boulevard sidewalk, the traffic signal upgrades, the Parks Master Plan, and the voice data upgrades.
And the unpaved alley. Did you mention that one?
Got it, thank you.
Yep. But I do believe that we might be at risk of losing some grant monies if we extend it beyond. I think the sidewalk ones I recall were CMAQ or some other type of funding that might have some deadlines to them.
Wasn't the Fountain Hills Boulevard, wasn't that for design?
I think
thought
it
that
was
was
for
for
design.
design.
I think it was for design. So if we've designed them but don't build them right away, I'm not sure what the risk is, but I think certainly looking at Saguaro Boulevard, but definitely ensuring we have our vision plan dialed into that so that we're making the most of that investment. And so that our return on investment is great. I think we need to tie in that SWABAC vision plan that we worked hard on, and I think most everybody is so energized about, which would include the pedestrian elements to get across Saguaro Boulevard. But certainly Saguaro, we put it off last year due to the economy, not wanting to really put more of a burden on the citizens, and I think that's always going to be a concern. But we're going to be a year further, and it certainly is not doing well given the rains we've had of late as well. So we're going to have to certainly look at that. So I'd like to get some more comments on that. Probably would help staff as well, or any of the other elements. The pavement management projects seem to really go up in price over the years 13 and 14 through 15 to, $800 or $900 or $800,000 plus per year. Is that because we haven't split them up into A's and B's yet?
Thank you, Mayor and Council. That could be the easy answer. I think at the same time, when you drop down to the 13, 14, and I was trying to calculate this out, you're back in Zone 1, and as we all know, Zone 1 are the oldest streets in town. So we must be looking at heavier applications for that area as well. It's a very large zone.
Okay.
Yes, sir, it is.
All right. That's why I think when Mary was illustrating that we wouldn't be able to get past the next year, it's because of the next year's budget that for that piece is, 50% larger than this year's or the year before.
If I could, Mayor, if I can add a comment here, I've been listening to the 6 projects that you've been mentioning. Just as a side comment, the alley paving is something that's related to the MAG IGA that we have on PM10 measures. But at the same time, we're receiving bids on those projects, and they're coming in very low, so we're happy to see that as well. So we might want to take a look at possibly reducing some of those numbers for a more up-to-date pricing, since we've been getting prices in.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Councilmember Leger?
Tom, just one additional question. Page 6, actually, it's up there right now. The prices you have, for example, FY 10-11, 515,000. Are these numbers from our pavement management plan that we had that you put before us at one time, or are they updated numbers?
Mayor and Council, they are numbers that we've been looking at. Of course, we can't project too far out because we're not sure what's going to happen with the oil market and with other markets and how prices are fluctuating and so volatile at this time. But we did update a lot of these numbers. And again, as we move in different zones with different quantities,
Sure.
then we may have different prices that we're looking at.
Yeah, it's difficult to do that out several years, but I was just wondering for 2010, 2011, the 515, how accurate that is with the cost of materials coming down. If we jumped on that project in the next fiscal year, would we be looking at 515 if prices stabilized or increased slightly?
That's a very good comment. I would say yes, it could reduce. At the same time, we're looking at, as Mr. Davis knows, we're being more innovative and looking at different applications. You may have read my email regarding that. So at this point, I would hold on to that number, not knowing what the future is in the next 18 months.
And based on that email, the product you were suggesting, wasn't that a less costly product than what we've used in the past?
Yes, sir.
And a more durable product?
It is not as durable as slurry seal, but it is a project because of the condition of the asphalt, and the pavement quality index, the PQI, was much higher in that zone because those asphalts weren't as old as the ones that you might find in Zone 1. So we're looking that hard at it to make sure that let's not spend anything we don't need to spend, and let's still use a product that's going to take us all the way around for the next application in the next 6 years.
Well, just simply piggybacking on what Mayor just mentioned a while ago, if there's any prices here that could be updated, that would be helpful in terms of our decision making. Thank you.
Certainly, certainly.
Councilmember Dickey?
Mayor, the intersection of Saguaro and Avenue of the Fountains, not that we have a lot of money in it, but the downtown redevelopment money could possibly be used there or not, since it's in the SWABAC plan.
I'll do my best to answer that. I believe we talked about that. I talked with Mr. Davis about that. We have a proposal in from SWABAC for that design. And so we're looking at the possibility of utilizing those funds for that. The construction dollars, I had worked them into the $4.5 million for the bond. That's where I made that assumption it was going to come from.
So you're talking, which fund are you speaking of?
The Downtown Development Fund, because just that tiny portion of it would be related to that, but I don't actually favor that. I favor what you're saying.
Right.
Because I think it has much more impact leaving it where it is than it would to just diminish the bond by that little amount.
Mayor and Council, we have considered utilizing some of those funds for design purposes for this project, but we haven't considered actual capital projects or construction that would come out of that. Keeping in mind that funding is really, whether it's used for the project that up to this point has been considered for the property next door, or it could be applied to as a way of leveraging participation in any number of projects that could occur in the downtown. So a caution there. Once that's gone, it is gone, and so be very cautious in that. But probably, I know we have talked about possibly financing the design portion, going through the intersection with that funding.
Not to pick on Downtown Development Fund, but any fund that we start to look at taking money out of to fund things that might not have been customarily funded out of that, I think we just need to make sure council's clear on what it was put in place for, what the intentions were, who's funding it, and those types of things.
Yes.
It's like we could probably make sense of it just talking, but I want to make sure we understand what it originated from or why it was originated.
And again, Mayor, I wasn't suggesting that because I don't think there's enough in there to really make a difference.
No.
So when you asked us earlier to give some indication, I was supportive of going ahead with the 4.5 bond last year or whenever that was, and I'm certainly open to talking about any of these options.
Thanks. All right. Any other questions about any of the CIP items? Funding, spending, additional funding sources, outstanding debt? You asked a question. We can't make decisions, Mary. How should staff proceed? That's up to you now.
Well, Mayor, members of the council, you've given us some direction. What we would ask is if you would like us to pursue the general obligation bonds issue, to firm them up a little more, to get more information about what the impacts would be at the $5, $10, and $20 million level, and to bring you back something a little more concrete than what we've been able to do just in this overview presentation.
Well, I heard Councilmember Archambault talk about paying for things that take longer time to draw out on, like the maintenance, and I think maybe something to guide us a little bit would be to not pay for something that over a longer period of time than we would feel the benefit from. I think Saguaro Boulevard's lasted, quite a long time, so a 20-year Saguaro Boulevard thing makes sense. If we need to go through our street maintenance and we're paying for 5 years and paying it over 20 years, I'm not sure if that makes as much sense or we'd be as comfortable with it, but
well, one of the things that would likely happen if we were to take the approach of a 5-year bond issue is at the end of the 5 years we would be coming back saying, okay, now we need to do the next 5 years. versus, and that's why I think we brought forward the plan for 10-year or 20-year, because it makes more sense to fund street projects over the life of the typical street, which is 20 years, and to have that funding drawn down as we need it. So you would be going forward today and paying 20 years on the funds drawn down today. So each segment of the road would have a 20-year life and a 20-year payback.
And wouldn't the same go for, you wouldn't take out $10 million when you only needed $5 million the first year, you'd take it out as you needed it?
That's correct.
Yeah. Educated me that last time. Rick, did you have something?
Only that there are certain advantages to, explained to us by our financial advisor, to bonding for 15-year period. He said 15 years or less. He says it's easier to find a buyer for the bonds, and in many cases the bank will actually assume the role of the buyer in those circumstances. Is a more favorable interest rate. He mentioned a number of advantages, I think, both the night he was here and then in meetings with our staff, to not going out too far with your bonding, not bringing it too closely, but really that 15 year is the magic number that he recommended, or less. So I think what I'm hearing is that probably we ought to look closer at the general obligation option, and that we ought to probably reconvene with our financial advisor and to get some very specific numbers to you relative to bonding at the 3 levels presented tonight.
Is there any council member that would not like us to look at, or is not as comfortable with, or is more comfortable with any of the particular options, so we don't spin staff's wheels here? Councilmember Shambo?
Yes, thank you. Rick, could staff look at maybe identifying a different revenue source for street maintenance?
Yes, well, for street maintenance itself, yes, we can. We can probably, so what we would do is concentrate our GO efforts on the Saguaro project. Excuse me.
Maybe I could jump in.
Well, Rick, I wouldn't be opposed.
And looking for a separate mechanism or options for the street maintenance portion. Is that
Well,
what you were saying?
We could look at a couple of different things. One would be a 15-year bond, like you were talking about, for maybe the 10-year maintenance project plus the Saguaro Boulevard project. The other thing you can look at is you might be able to identify a revenue source that pays the maintenance portion of that bond back, or generates enough revenue to pay that back, which may be a little bit less painful than trying to find a revenue source that's going to pay our maintenance every year. But I would like to see some different options in those areas besides just a bond.
Understood.
So that the council has a diversified, or not trying to confuse or convolute anything, but just so that we have other options to look at.
Okay, we will go back and do some more homework then.
Thank you.
Sure.
Anything else you want to add?
Well, I just wanted to thank you for asking. I would just add that I think generally, and I know our budget has seen extraordinary change, but this is perhaps our new normal, as has been alluded to before. And the fact is that the economy's taken the turn. I know we're all sensitive to the fact that the economy's downturn means the citizens in the communities' budgets have taken a downturn, and looking for more funding from other sources is looking for more funding from our residents at a time when it's not a comfortable time to consider that for probably many of us. So unless it is correlated directly to that service, I just think it's going to be difficult for me to get in support of a fee or a tax towards something that's not directed directly towards that improvement. Councilmember Dickey?
Mayor, I wanted to point out, when you say maintenance, it has a kind of a shallow connotation, but these projects are more than just sweeping the street. So I think there's more hard value to them, so I wanted to bring that part up. And when you mention the new normal, I also always go back to the fact that our folks recognize that we had a problem here long before this actual downturn. So it is appropriate, at least in the long run, to look at funding that addresses quote-unquote maintenance items, because we have a problem with that. So I don't want to dismiss it out of hand.
And I'm not, it's not black or white. I think what we've noticed now dealing with this economic downturn here is the new normal. Once we're past build-out, we're having a good idea of what it's going to look like. And we realize that we don't have a real sustainable financial model to deal with. So I understand that piece. I'm just sensitive to considering increasing taxes or fees in particular on people's month-to-month outlay to pay for things that may be maintenance, but they could be long-term maintenance or streets. I'd just like to have a better correlation between that expenditure and or tax or fee and the actual improvement or maintenance. Dennis, is anything down there? Any questions on CIP? Anything else?
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Sorry for my allergy attack.
No, sure. Do you have water down there?
No, that wouldn't give me any one. I'm just kidding. I was well hydrated. I usually forget about the throat issue.
Budget cuts are only 5 waters tonight.
She's going to throw the water at me now.
All right, next item is discussion relating to proposed funding options for the community service contracts.
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. 3 years ago, the town issued a request for proposal for programs that the town did not provide, that weren't currently provided. Those activities were tourism, youth arts, youth sports, and the food bank. And those contracts were issued 3 years ago and all expire on June 30th, 2010. So we formed a committee. The mayor appointed a committee to review these contracts and try to look forward with them. And at this time, I'd like to take an opportunity to thank all the members for their efforts. This required 2-hour meetings before each council meeting, and I appreciate the dedication that each of the members provided for those meetings, as well as their input.
Yeah, thank you very much.
After reviewing what those current contracts are and what the scenarios were, the committee made these recommendations. The committee agreed, and we came to a consensus that in order to create that we needed to create a dedicated fund for these type of contracts, that we didn't want to compete with the general fund every year in trying to fund these activities, but if we created a dedicated fund that we could dedicate to specifically for those services. And so in light of that, we would extend the contracts for 1 more year to create a new contract for the following year with performance indicators. Excuse me, it's catchy. And also we interviewed all of the contractors. The current ones, had them come in and told us, gave us a proposal as to what they would require and what they would do for those funds. And this is a summary of those. The tourism requested $150,000. The Boys and Girls Club, $100,000, and those two are consistent with what they're currently being funded. The community theater requested $80,000, and the food bank $44,000. So the total of those contracts is $374,000. The committee recommended to fund these in a separate fund, but it has to be a blended. Well, it doesn't have to be. We created a blended scenario, and the reason we did is one of the options was to increase our transient lodging or our bed tax to 5%. The challenge that we have with that is a revenue source that's from fewer than 10 taxpayers, and so revealing how much money we get from tourism is something that we can't do. So if we wanted to just use the bed tax, we wouldn't be able to identify the amount of money. So this is a blending option. The first one was to increase the telecommunications tax from the current 2.6% to 3%. Increase the transient lodging of the bed tax from 2.6 to 5%. Increase the restaurant bar tax from 2.6 to whatever we needed to make up the difference to get to that $374,000. And then the committee also recommended a one-time transfer from economic development or the downtown fund of $50,000 to put into that dedicated fund. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions at this point. On the next slide, what I have done is come up with different scenarios of different rates. The third one is the asterisk. That's the one that the committee recommended, and that gets us to the 374. But I put in other rates, and again, they're blended. I can't break them out for different scenarios for the council to consider. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that the committee or that the council has.
All right. Anything, looks like you focused primarily on funding, dollar amounts, and perhaps potentially sources, obviously. Is there any discussion on levels of service or return on investment, town savings? Most of these, I would imagine, if we didn't contract out, we'd have to do it in-house, and or was there much for evaluations with that respect?
Mayor, some members of the council, yes, we did talk about it. Because of the time frame that we had, there wasn't enough time to come up with this process as well as come up with performance indicators. So the proposal would be to renew the contracts for one more year, and then the committee would continue to meet and develop then the performance measures. How would we measure success? What does it look like? So we have a way to evaluate the success of the programs. So yes, but that wouldn't be at this point. That would be going forward.
Okay. And so you mentioned Chamber of Commerce, which is our tourism, and Boys and Girls Club are illustrated here as the same level they are for 09-10, and then the community theater is what, 50,000 less than I think this year was 130.
Yes, Mayor, that's correct.
All right, and then extended hands, was that 50,000 this year? No.
44,000.
Oh, so that's the same as well. Okay.
Yes, Mayor.
All right, thank you. Councilmember Hanson?
Just to point out on the theater, when we talked to Ross, he identified that 80,000 as being specifically for their youth theater. And there were some other additional programs that had gone into play previously, and he said they really wanted to concentrate on maintaining the level of service with the youth theater. And on one other thing, when we're talking about the one-time transfer from economic development, there were some of us on the committee that felt that rather than a one-time thing, that would be an annual thing, since economic development and tourism they complement each other, and that going forward to continue to fund the tourism efforts, which has the ability to bring revenues to the town, that would be an annual transfer of 50,000.
In addition to the bed tax?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, that was the only change. It wasn't just a one-time, it was an annual.
So would it be literally a different fund, or are we just calling it a fund?
Mayor, Sloan, members of council, it would be a dedicated restricted fund where it would be separate from the general fund. And the revenues that would be, that we're proposing, if they were approved, those revenues would go into that fund, and they would stay there. They would not go back into the general fund.
Okay. Councilmember Shambo?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. On the $50,000, we talked at length of whether, actually we started with $150,000 from the downtown fund, and it got reduced to $50,000, and that was a one-time shot, at least to my understanding. And I know that we had so many different conversations on it that I'm not even sure if everybody understood, although I thought Julie clarified it pretty well at the end of the meeting. One of the things I've been opposed to is, this is the danger, is if we start taking money from economic development, and we move it to tourism, there's no measuring point tourism, or if you take the 50,000 and add it to the community contracts, it's just always going to go to the community contracts, but there's no, what's the word I'm looking for, Julie? There's no gauge that enhances that. When you do a bed tax, the more bedding, the more beds you book, the more tax you receive, the more you can send out to tourism. There's a delta there. There's a correlation. Downtown development is basically dependent on construction, and we don't have any construction going on right now. So if we move that $50,000 a year, we're just going to keep diminishing that number. And I think it's wrong, and this is just my opinion, but I think it's wrong to take downtown development money and move it to the community contracts. Our charge, and I take my charge seriously, but when we went into this committee, my charge was to identify additional revenue sources to fund community contracts. That's not an additional revenue source.
Well, I wasn't, I'll say, as far as what you were charged with, it was to look into the community contracts, not to find additional revenue for it.
That's what I was told.
Additional revenue.
Yeah,
But-
find outside revenue sources from the general fund.
Okay. Councilmember Dickey?
Mayor, I have a general comment that just for myself, I'm not ready to look at any of the recommendations for funding until we get the performance piece. I mean, if we just say, look, we don't have time to do this now, let's just extend for another year under the same circumstances and, maybe change the amounts if that's legal. But as far as looking at taxes to fund these things without talking about performance and what we want out of it, I wouldn't be ready to go to that without that piece.
Okay. Councilmember Contino?
Thank you, Mayor. I think that the project that we've been working on for the funding has been very well. I think that the 50,000 we're talking about the downtown economic development is in part due to tourism coming into town and spending the money. And in doing that, they do everything as well as the people come in, shop and buy, and as well as other people come in and say, wow, what a neat community. So what we're doing is we're trying to bring people in, and I think that downtown economic development is a standard part of that, and we did talk about extending that 50,000 every year.
I think that kind of echoes a little bit what I was saying on the last item, was that raising fees or raising taxes to fund anything that may not be directly related or seen to have a empirical public benefit is going to be challenging given the economy, and people just don't have money to pay extra dollars for things. So what would help me is if it's not going to be performance indicators, it would have to at least be if tourism is obviously related towards tourism and visitors and those types of things, what would if we would have a choice to not continue that program or do it in-house, need to be some understanding about what that would cost us if we eliminated, or reduced tourism funding. What would that mean to us in our future? Like Dennis was saying, if we reduce our spending, then we would expect less visitors, I would suspect. The Boys and Girls Club, I think that funds largely the teen center. If that's not funded, we likely need to do something for teens. What would that look like? What would that cost if we were to do it? Or what would the reduction in services look like if we were to fund a lesser number than what we funded this year? The community theater, same type of thing. This is youth-oriented investment there. When we started to do 3 years ago, the contracting outside of the town and putting a more formal package together, which would allow the organizations to realize 3 years of funding and be able to be empowered to maybe make some investments in their facilities or do other things, generally have a commitment from the town towards those functions. It also we did talk about savings to the town, or by the town not doing these services, we're in essence contracting out some services. What is that saving us? So I know there was some discussion in that respect, and those are the things that would help me, is to understand if we reduce the services, what does that mean to our citizens, the youth in particular, with a couple of these, tourism or economic development on the other, or how much would it cost if we weren't to fund a contracted source to be bringing it in-house, in essence, I'm assuming. That's going to be higher, at least on the onset. Those would help rather than, but we can certainly have a discussion about raising telecom tax and bed taxes and other taxes. I just don't know how fruitful that's going to be as far as a dialogue with our council. Councilmember Hanson?
Well, I think Scottsdale kind of took this route. They just increased their bed tax to support tourism specifically. And I think when we look at these 4 different groups, we see each of them have evolved over the years. They've really filled a void in our community, and I think what we heard from most of the groups, that if this funding went away, the programs would probably go away. And I know the economy is really tight, but for $374,000, do we want to take 10 steps backwards over programs that have evolved and serve the community quite well? As far as the performance measures go, I think the understanding, like Julie said, because we had limited time, that we didn't want to just say, okay, the funding has to stop. We wanted to come up with a transitional method to keep the groups intact and keep the programs going while we kind of went to greater depth to come up with what the ultimate program would really look like. So this is really kind of just an extension of, where we're at right now, more than a brand new program. And I think the funding that we came up with was an attempt to get through the next year while we, come up with the ultimate program.
And I wasn't, you alluded to, if we got rid of these programs, I wasn't looking at that as really being an option. I think each one of these, they clearly serve a pretty good need in our community. But what we're looking at is changing it, coming from the general fund, but coming from a new revenue source. That's that's something I'm probably not going to be able to get over or comfortable with. When I mentioned having direct impact or having fees related to those actual services, maybe the bed tax is in alignment with where I would be comfortable potentially, because you're right, that funds the tourism in essence. I'm not sure on the other items outside of the bed tax. Telecom, I'm not sure how we could rationalize that fee going up to fund something, these items here, but I do appreciate your take on the extension, the one additional year. We may come to that.
Mayor? Here.
There.
If I could just comment, that I understand and I totally agree with the rationale and the nexus between the bed tax and tourism. The challenge that we have is we can't just isolate the bed tax for tourism, because the bed tax is a revenue that identifies with taxpayers, fewer than 10. So we have the confidentiality statute that we have to worry about. And so that's why we approached it, that we had to blend it with something so that we would have the ability to fund it without releasing that information. So, and then the second point I wanted to make is that none of these programs are budgeted in the general fund for next year. There was no room in the budget for them. So if we don't identify a new revenue source, I don't know how we can fit them into next year's budget. And so that's kind of why we wanted to bring it at this point of the game, because we're getting close to finishing the budget. And if their programs are going to go away, then I think we need to let the contractors know now. Or pretty soon, sorry.
Well,
So we took them out of the general fund.
Honestly, we just couldn't find the source of revenues to pay for it. We're struggling now to try to to fit everything in. But yes, they're not included in the budget.
Mayor.
Councilmember Leger.
Julie, to your last point, is there a way to take in the event that we do have bed tax, and if we increased it and we moved in that direction, I agree with the mayor wholeheartedly. There's a direct correlation between that and tourism, for example. Is there a way to take the bed tax and commingle it in another fund so that you wouldn't have that issue in terms of saying we just have a bed tax fund and there's X amount of money in it, which then would violate the law in terms of disclosing how much that is? For example, if we took the Downtown Development Fund and renamed it something and commingled that 0.1% excise tax with bed tax at a new level, i.e. 3%, and commingle that, would that legally take care of that challenge?
Mayor, Councilmember Leger, the challenge would become that we still can't isolate the dollar amount, so you would have competing dollars. There would be no way to say 150 of this is for tourism because this is how much bed tax came in. You could certainly commingle it, which is what we were doing with the other funds, but you would still be competing because there's no way to isolate the number and say this much came in for tourism, so this is what we need to dedicate to tourism. So you would have two competing interests, one for tourism, one for economic development, fighting over one pot of money.
What I'm suggesting is renaming it and just making that fund, whatever it's named, a dedicated source for tourism, so that you're not getting into that discussion. You're basically saying that tourism will be funded out of Fund XYZ, and that XYZ fund happens to be a 0.1% excise tax plus bed tax, and it all kind of goes into this pot, and you're not really disclosing exactly what you're spending in bed tax. So that's something I've been noodling on for a while in terms of our challenge here, and I think it merits some serious consideration. Listening to the mayor earlier, you were really talking about unintended consequences. I mean, by not doing things sometimes it costs us more in the long run than paying for those services, and I think that's an important analysis. And when we look, we've had this conversation before, when we look at, culturally our town and the aversion to a primary property tax, I mean, think about it. I mean, the state funding is diminishing. It's going to continue to diminish. We don't have a primary property tax to support the operation of our town. We're looking at possibly GO bonds that have their negative consequences. What is really left to fund what we do other than sales tax revenue that we can kind of quasi-depend on? And every community has the same challenge, and they're drilling down on tourism and visitors and bringing visitors. So I think that that's key. And to commingle a fund in order to come up with a dedicated fund to be able to fund that, I think is extremely important. And I'm not negating any of the other deals there too. I would look possibly at other ways of looking at that, even if we were to look at going to the general fund and doing another, I won't use the word sweep, but taking another look there. So the notion of commingling and calling it something else and making that the dedicated fund for tourism, my thinking is if the levels of funding were not unrealistic and our Visitors Bureau could start matching that with other sources, we could manage that and still have adequate dollars in there for our economic development, and we wouldn't be, robbing Peter to pay Paul for that. So, thank you, Mayor.
Okay.
Good time.
Wow. Yeah, Mike?
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, maybe if I could clarify some of these different taxes we're talking about. The bed tax, I mean, clearly you're going to hit visitors that come here, and one of the things the committee looked at was how comparable would we be to the surrounding areas. And with raising the bed tax to that number, I think we're still competitive with the surrounding areas, so it isn't like we would bleed or lose people bedding to another community. Although Scottsdale is a very strong puller from us, and I don't know that $2 or $3 in your bill is going to make that big of a difference, but obviously they still pull from us because they've got the Marriott is just over the hill. But looking at the, let's look at the restaurant and bar tax. We talked about raising it, if we just go down to scenario 4, it's 0.4%. On a $30 restaurant bill, that makes a 12-cent difference. So I don't think that it's painful. I don't think that and of course, it's a discretionary expense. You either go out and eat or you don't go out and eat. But that little bit of difference, I don't think is huge in that it's going to make that big of a difference. The other thing is the telecommunication tax. And again, the committee was trying to do a blend because of the scenario that Julie eloquently described to us. And if you took a cell phone bill, you get a $100 cell phone bill, the difference in the tax rate and telecommunication tax that we're talking about is 40 cents. So if your phone bill was, like a phone bill that's $91.20, add 40 cents to that roughly, be $90.60 instead of $91.20. So it's not a huge amount when you look at it in small bites. And again, telecommunication tax, most of us have cell phones. It's really a luxury. And a lot of us have cell phones and get rid of our landlines. So it's, we didn't think that those would seem to be the taxes that we didn't feel were going to be huge impacts on our particular citizens, but would actually target more of the visitors, especially the restaurant bar tax and the bed tax, that would help fund the types of services that we think this community needs to provide its citizens. And again, it's a question the council has to answer for themselves, is this is a quality of life issue. I think all of us can argue that tourism is definitely goes hand in hand with economic development. And if you were to eliminate the two, you could just watch the town shrivel up. And if you go on, you can talk about the community theater. We have a stellar community theater. Certainly the children's theater, and Ross could be here and taking up a lot of your time and describing to you the benefits of the youth in this town that community theater helps. What were the other scenarios? We got the food bank. Their budget for the food bank, what was that, Julie? $400 and some thousand a year to operate that food bank? It's the number that I seem to remember. I don't have the exact number, but it was like $400,000 a year. We're talking about $44,000 a year. Better than 50% of the people they service at the food bank are Fountain Hills residents.
Mike, I think that for me, that type of information is very helpful because when I look at the other organizations, they can sometimes leverage what we give them to get more in return for our community, and it's that type of information would be helpful as well.
Yeah, and so those are the type of things that we said, well, these are quality of life issues. They're quality of life issues that the council identified in previous years, and we were just trying to carry forward those. And that we were very sensitive to the fact that you alluded to, that we don't want to tax our residents, but however, we have to identify a separate revenue source because we just don't have it.
Well, you guys are we're looking to carry forward these, I would imagine, but also I think I wasn't really necessarily looking at the new revenue sources.
But we were just trying to identify something that, and I was trying to put it in perspective, 12 cents when you go out for a normal meal, that's really pretty much nothing. So, thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Councilmember Dickey?
Mayor, thanks. You said quality of life, and I absolutely agree with you. As a matter of fact, there was just a report that came out from the National Council of Nonprofits on how the economy is really hurting that kind of thing. But what I said before was that without the performance measures or some kind of a report, it's really hard to recommend a permanent revenue source in the form of a higher tax without knowing where are we going. Are we going to have to go out for another RFP? Will there be different entire entities responding to try to fill this? So because right now we're kind of in a vacuum on how we're making these decisions. I don't want to see any of them go away either, but does diminishing our support truly make any of them totally go away. I want to see that. I want to understand that part of that. Like the, you know, the $100,000, does that mean teen activity goes away? Does, what does that mean to the Commerce, Chamber of Commerce, if it's not 150? Does it mean stopping? So I guess I need more information before I would say, then, is it going to be these people, or is it going to be 4 other entities who can respond and try to do that? What does the amount have to be? Because when we look at these different scenarios and they come up with different amounts, what do we actually really need? So if it's possible, and I know you're doing the budget already, but if it's possible to move ahead with a year extension, and maybe in a smaller amount, and talk about some of these other things that we were saying about looking at, like you mentioned, at the CIP, what don't we have to do maybe, or what won't we do? 200 grand for parks, I'm sorry, but if that's possibly in there, or part of that is in there, how do we get through this year without taking these other steps first before we start trying to raise taxes? I think that's pretty much where I'm coming from, without diminishing the value of any of these.
Thank you. Councilmember Contino.
Thank you. I think that I'll go along with the other council members on this side, but I believe that what we looked at is also having a pattern in a reporting of where the money's going. And I think that's what we have to take a look at right now, is how is it being used for the amount of money that we're giving everybody. And there are ways you can do that, and I know that when I ran the food bank, we had to disclose everything we did with all the money the town gave us. And I think this is what we have to sit back and take a look at also. But I think that in the taxing aspect of this, I really don't feel like this is hurting anybody in the general public, because the other night I went to a local restaurant and all their prices went up a couple bucks. So, I mean, are we any different than anybody else? It's private business, and I think that we can take a look at that and say, for no more than we talked about going up on those little tiny percentages, it didn't bother anybody, and we debated about this for a long time.
So you're telling me we already got our raise because they raised their prices, sales taxes, and
You're darn right.
collections are going up, we're all taken care of.
You betcha, we're going right with them.
Potentially. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Leger?
Julia, a question and a comment. Just for the benefit of the public that might be tuning into this, our current bed tax is at what level, please?
3%,
3%. And our current telecom tax?
2.6%,
2.6%. And our current restaurant bar tax,
2.6%.
as Mike had mentioned. Okay. And just a comment, you know, I have a tendency to agree with Councilwoman Dickey. I find it a hard time going to the public for tax to begin with, let alone increasing fees to bring in additional revenue without any performance criteria or rationale. And because we're in extraordinary sets of circumstances with respect to our budgeting and just where we're at in the economy, maybe as a means of a compromise, would it be too much to establish performance measurements soon? We couldn't do that in 30 days?
Sorry, I didn't mean, Mayor, Councilman Leger, I didn't mean to say no. What I was saying was it would not be too much to ask. We actually, when we had presentations by the groups, we asked them, how would you measure success?
Exactly.
But the issue is that we wouldn't have time to draw up contracts, go through that whole process. But we certainly had planned on coming up with a revised scope of work with the existing contract, with what measures we as a town would like to see, but also ask them how they measure success so that we don't give them measurements they don't have.
Exactly.
Then that'd be something we could do very quickly.
And outside the context of a contract, maybe it could be something like a memorandum of agreement where we look at the existing contract where there are measurements in there and maybe come up and firm up some measurements, and perhaps Councilwoman Dickey would be comfortable with that, whereby there are some performance criteria, because the way it was presented, it almost sounded like performance criteria was, you know, out the window. I struggle without having performance criteria, but if we could make some adjustments, and then as Vice Mayor Hansen said, we can take the next year to really, refine those if at all possible, but I wouldn't feel comfortable going into an increase without some sort of memorandum of agreement as an addendum to the existing contract. Thank you, Mayor.
Mayor, Councilman Jay, I'm sorry if I gave that impression, but that was our intention. That was the committee's intention to continue on. And if the council approved, funding for the groups, that the next step would then to go back to the groups and start working on the performance indicators.
So you would be doing that then?
Yes.
Thank you.
Councilmember Dickey? I'm sorry. Oh, my gosh. Had to do that every once a meeting.
Yeah.
Vice Mayor, I'll give it even right. Hanson?
We've had these contracts for 3 years, and the contracts currently have performance measures in them. And I think our intent was to go forward based on the same performance measures and then fine-tune them over the coming year. So I don't think it's a matter of going forward without saying, okay, Frank, you have no accountability in this whatsoever. We're just going to give you the money and you can take it and run.
Right.
And when we're looking at also, I know you were more comfortable with the bed tax, but if we look at the restaurant bar tax, for the Tourism Bureau, it's not just a Fountain Hills Tourism Bureau. It's really a regional tourism bureau. And with their increased advertising now, they're reaching a greater number of people. So, we have people coming from Tonto Verde and Rio Verde and certainly Fort McDowell to our restaurants. And, all their efforts in bringing the people to the town certainly impact our restaurants as well. And a strong component of the Tourism Bureau is the relationship that has built up with our neighbors, with Fort McDowell. And that's become a really strong working bond. And, I mean, that's just another reason we wouldn't want to, fall back and diminish that in any way.
Good. Councilmember Leger?
I clearly understand that we have performance criteria in our contracts currently. However, those contracts are expiring. And the dialogue over the last year and maybe the last 2 years was to enhance those performance criteria well before we had this discussion. So I don't think that we're stating that there's no criteria, and I feel very comfortable with our service providers. But I think it's an opportunity to look at continuous improvement. I mean, if we can, in the next, 30 days, come up with some enhanced measures of performance, that would give me a better comfort level for taxing our citizens to continue this service. It's just simply stated, so it's not a matter of trust. It just seems rather logical in the spirit of continuous improvement. Thank you, Mayor.
Of course, no firm decisions are being made tonight, but there'll be more dialogue probably on things we didn't even talk about yet, even related to these items. But again, I haven't heard anybody say we're looking to stop these services from being rendered for our community, because the partnership we've had for even just the last 3 years, although most of them were in place far before that, they've just become they've become contracted over the last 3 years, where these performance measures and scopes of work have actually been illustrated on paper and signed to. That's helped us a great deal, but these are great partners that have delivered a great amount of service to our community and are just that, great community partners. So I don't think they're at risk of being eliminated completely or reduced to where they're not going to be effective. I sure hope not, but a lot of things are in our budget as we'll get more into our programs and such that we deliver as directly from the town. Was there another hand up here? Good news as we close then is that fortunately our budget is in good shape as far as our general fund savings and capital improvement fund savings. We've kept and maintained and grew our fund balances over the last several years, so we're in good shape going into a tough time. So I just wanted to mention that. We've done a good job managing it, but I also know that sales taxes and such are not looking as rosy as we were hoping, so we're going to have more discussions on more budgetary items in the near future. Anything more on community contracts and before we close out? I think that's it. All right, look for a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
A second, anyone? No seconds. There's a second, all right. All in favor, indicate by saying aye. Aye?
Aye.
Thank you.
Wonder how long it's gonna take somebody.
Good job.
Um,